So we reach into the raging chaos and we cling to it, and we tell ourselves it has meaning, and that the world is good, and that we are not evil, and we will all go home in the end. Welcome back everyone. In today's video, I'm finally continuing my foray into the Vampire Chronicles series. We are now on book 4, The Tale of the Body Thief. I'll just get this out of the way. I think this is possibly my favourite book in the series so far, which surprised me because it is a bit of a shift in tone from the previous 3 books, which are somewhat of a trilogy, and this is more of a standalone. But let's get into why I think this is a fantastic entry in the series. Part 1. Summary. The Tale of the Body Thief follows Lestat some time after the events of the Queen of the Damned. Bored with his powers, lonely among the vampires, and conflicted with his craving for human blood, and haunted with nightmares of his daughter Claudia, Lestat's only true friend is the human David Talbot. When David refuses Lestat's offer of the Dark Gift, Lestat contemplates and even half-heartedly attempts suicide. Lestat's misery is lifted when Raglan James, a former member of David's organisation, the Talamasca, offers Lestat his human body for one day if Lestat will swap with him. Despite the protests of Louis and David, the reckless vampire accepts and soon finds himself trapped in his new form, as James has no intention of swapping back. Abandoned by his vampire brethren, with only David's help, Lestat embarks on a quest to regain his previous body, experiencing the many pleasures and pains of humanity along the way. Part 1. The Shadow of Interview with a Vampire. So when I was reading this book, I did note how different it was in style from the previous books, but one similarity that I did notice was between this book and the very first book, Interview with a Vampire. In a lot of ways, I think The Tale of the Body Thief is almost a shadow novel of that first book. Unlike The Vampire Lestat, and especially The Queen of the Damned, which were much more focused on building the vampire mythology, Interview with a Vampire and The Tale of the Body Thief tell much more intimate personal stories, focusing on one vampire or one human and their experiences. In Interview with a Vampire, we had Louis, who began the novel as a human, turned into a vampire, and the novel was very much an exploration of what that would be like. What is it like to be an immortal being, living through time, having to feed off of human beings? In The Tale of the Body Thief, we get the reverse of that, as Lestat begins as a vampire, unsatisfied with his life, much like Louis began his life as a human, unhappy with his life. Then Lestat shifts, becomes human, and has to deal with the consequences of now being a human after being an immortal being for so long. So that general plot thread, I think, is very similar to what we had in Interview with a Vampire. And that's why I say that in a way, The Tale of the Body Thief to me seems to be a shadowing of that first book. Probably my favourite part of this book is the pretty big portion of the novel which deals with Lestat becoming a human again and realising that being a human is kind of gross, has its own problems, and maybe not really that worth it after all. At this point, Lestat has been a vampire for hundreds of years, and he's kind of forgotten and begun to romanticise what being a human was. So when he becomes a human and he has to deal with aches and pains and going to the toilet and being drunk and ill, he realises how really crap it is to be a biological being with all of these needs and functions that are really gross. In comparison to a vampire, vampires are very elegant, the only thing they really have to do, physically speaking, is feed off of human blood, and as they age, even that desire goes away. So vampires, while yes, they're detached and outside of the world, have a certain elegance to them that human beings as biological beings don't have, and seeing Lestat realise this as he becomes a human is really funny, and also a bit tragic because it really does have an effect on him when he initially becomes a human and really doesn't like it. It's also funny watching him slowly come to like certain aspects of being human. The first thing that he tends to like is wine, which is just kind of funny. The first thing that he likes is being drunk, and then he slowly comes to like other things about being human as well. Although ultimately he does want to be a vampire. He does realise that that is actually not necessarily the best existence, but at least both kinds of existence have their own problems. So yes, I think there is a lot of shadowing going on in this novel and Interview with a Vampire. And one thing that I think might be interesting to do, and that I might even do myself now that I've read this, is to go back, read Interview, and look and see if there are more connections there, because I certainly think there are some. For instance, you have the character of David, who is a human who's kind of on the brink of death, he's very old, and Lestat wanting to make him into a vampire to stop that. This echoing perhaps Claudia's character, who, although she wasn't old, she was certainly about to die when she was made into a vampire, so you've got things there. You've also got a love interest for Lestat called Gretchen, who is a human nun, and She is very much grounded in her humanity, even though she's fascinated by vampires, at least when she first meets Lestat in his human form and he tells her. And again, I see her in some ways as mirroring Louis, who, as we all know from previous books, is not particularly happy with his vampiric form. He's very brooding. He would much rather be a human and is often described as being a human. So there are lots of connections there that we could make and get into, and when you're reading this, if you've read Interview with the Vampire before this, which you definitely should if not afterwards, I think it's worth looking at that and looking at those parallels, because I think there's lots of interesting stuff there to dig out. There is one big difference though between The Tale of the Body Thief and Interview with the Vampire, and that is that now we're following Lestat, so you can imagine the tale is not as dark and brooding, or not even as nihilistic, as Interview with the Vampire was. Interview with the Vampire, as I said in my review, is a very dark, miserable book, and it's quite hard to read because of that. Whereas the Lestat books, much more vibrant in tone, even though they deal with dark themes, and this book certainly does. Lestat even has his brooding moments in this book. But still, it does have a much more dynamic style to it, a vibrancy to it, because Lestat's character is just vibrant, bright, he's got lots of personality, in a way that Louis, who tends to be more morose, doesn't always have. So there are differences between the two, and I do think The Tale of the Body Thief, if we were to put these two together, is definitely better because it has more shades to it than Interview with the Vampire did. Also, now we're on book 4, Anne Rice's writing style has really come into its own. She's really good at crafting characters by this point. Lestat feels more fleshed out than ever before in this book, so again, it's just building on the characters, and it's just really, really good. Even Louis, who appears in this book, is really well done in this book as well. Part 2. A morality complex. One of the big themes of this book, perhaps even more so than other books, is the idea of morality and whether people should be good or bad. At the beginning of the book, we see Lestat for the first time really struggling with killing human beings, and he now only kills criminals, and the kind of opening scene is him chasing a criminal who's about to murder someone else, and then he gets conflicted because he finds out this criminal isn't just malicious, they're actually mentally ill, and he has this whole conundrum going on. So we see Lestat beginning at this book with a moral dilemma. What's interesting though about Lestat's character is that even though he has this moral dilemma at the beginning, he feels like he is doing something wrong if he kills innocent people. When he discusses morality with people, he just doesn't come across as someone that really cares that much about morality. There are two significant things here. So first of all, we have his conversations with Gretchen the nun. Now Gretchen talks about sacrificing her natural abilities as a piano player in order to do good to humanity. She thinks that that cause is way more important than her playing piano, so she gives that up. She wants to help people. And Lestat just can't understand this, and they have a big, interesting discussion about whether that's the right thing to do. Also, Lestat has a discussion with David about God and the devil, and Lestat doesn't think that God exists, like most vampires, very nihilistic, but David thinks that God does exist and gives Lestat a very interesting story about seeing God and the devil in a hotel having a conversation in human guise, and he doesn't believe him. Now this is really interesting because for a character who seems to care a lot about morality and is conflicted and feels guilt, he then, when he's in discussions, like intellectually, he never seems to think that it does exist, he seems to reject it. Now this makes for a really interesting character because there's just so much conflict going on there. And even at the end of the book, although Lestat does somewhat more embrace his vampiric side and his evil side, as you'll see when you read it with the final act of the book, he still feels that guilt, he still feels that remorse, and it's not something that's going to go away. And he recognises that that loneliness and that darkness is always going to be there. And again, that's fantastic because it captures something that I think a lot of novels don't always capture, which is that there is always going to be, with any resolution, some unresolved tension. And it works really well that Lestat, although he goes on this journey and comes to be somewhat more happy with his nature as a vampire and morality, he still has that lingering sense of guilt behind, despite everything he's been through. Another big morality theme in this book, and something that recurs a lot throughout, is Lestat's guilt about Claudia. Now Claudia appears mostly in this book as a hallucination, and certainly she has a bigger presence than she has ever had since Interview with the Vampire. She's constantly haunting Lestat throughout, commentating on what he's doing as a human being, his treatment of Gretchen, his treatment of David, his treatment of Louis, and those scenes are fantastic, because we see Lestat being more vulnerable, which is something that in the previous books he's always he does have his moments of vulnerability, but generally he's quite brash and boisterous and strong, so it's nice to see him having that vulnerability. And it's nice to see how much Claudia's death actually affected him, because as Louis tells the story, you get a sense that Lestat doesn't really care all that much. And although we do see a bit of Lestat's guilt and stuff in the previous books, we really get a sense for how big the mistake that he made in making Claudia has hit him. And again, that adds to the whole morality theme of the book, the fact that he's still haunted after all these years about what he did to Claudia. These morality parts as well are some of the best parts of the book. I really enjoy the scenes with Gretchen where she's talking about celibacy and her reasons for being celibate to Lestat. There's some really interesting arguments there. She's a really great character, and I don't think she'll be in future books, but their relationship and the discussions they had were fantastic. Likewise with David and even with Louis, all of those big conversations that we kind of expect from Rice at this point. She loves to philosophize and get into all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of that going on in the discussions, and it's really well done and it's really interesting. So be on the lookout for those things, because they're some of the best parts of the book. Part 3. Love and Romance. So the third biggest thing that occurs in this book, I would say, are the relationships. In particular, Lestat's romances with David and Gretchen. And also a little bit his relationships with Claudia. I won't talk about that much because we already talked about that a lot in the previous section. And his relationship with Louis, who finally has a bit more book time in this one, although not as much as David and Gretchen. What I enjoy most about these relationships, especially between David and Gretchen, are the twists that they make. Because when we're introduced to these characters, we're introduced to Gretchen, who, despite being very virtuous, is somewhat interested in Lestat's story about being a vampire, and she calls him to come back to her once he has returned into his natural or unnatural state. On the flip side of that, we have David, who, even though him and Lestat are good friends, he is always refusing the dark gift. At the end of The Queen of the Damned, we saw this. Lestat offered David if he wanted to become a vampire. David said no, but Lestat boldly said, "Oh, you will at some time, and I'll be there. Maybe I won't give you the dark gift, but I'll be there to kind of gloat." And still in this book, David refuses. And that sets up a certain dynamic, and that dynamic throughout the novel is constantly shifting, especially as Lestat's relationship with David, when they become human, develops into a potentially sexual relationship, which doesn't quite get there, which is a bit of a, probably my least favourite bit of the novel. I really wanted them two to hook up, but they didn't. But I did like their relationship and the way that it developed. So we have this development of relationships with these two, and the way they begin and the way that they end is just so different and unexpected, but done in an organic way. It makes sense as to why they end up, how they end up, without going too much into spoilers there. It's something to look out for, but that juxtaposition of the start and the end with those two storylines is excellent. And the relationships, again, are just really well built. It's slow, it takes its time, and Rice never rushes things, especially with her characters and relationships. It's nice to have that. It's nice to have a relationship that slowly builds and blossoms, rather than one that, love at first sight, that kind of thing. In terms of Lestat's relationship with Louis, it doesn't develop all that much. It's still very much the same that it has been since the previous two books, which is to say that they do love each other, but Louis has a lot of bitterness and resentment towards Lestat for everything that has happened, and that's still very much the case in this book. But what's interesting and nice to see is that we get certain bits of passages of the book where Lestat talks about how their relationship actually works, and the ways in which they get on and don't get on now. And it's nice to get that bit of intimacy and detail into their relationship. Because in the previous two books, where the book is much more focused on plot, there is character development in those books, but it's very much focused on the things happening around in the moment. There's not much time to reflect on what's going on, or for people to have daily lives, if you like. Whereas in this book we get passages talking about Louis and the fact that he lives in decrepitude, and he sometimes comes to Lestat's because he does sort of like all the fancy things, and he likes to watch films, but then he'll reject it and say, "Lestat, how can you live like this? It's disgusting," and then go back to his hovel. So it's nice to have those moments and that development. Even if the overall relationship is the same, it's just nice to have that bit of detail with these two. And I really did enjoy those passages, as brief as they were. Also, again, not to spoil too much, but they do have a great scene where Lestat goes to Louis for help after he's become a human, and like the conversations with Gretchen about celibacy and the conversation with David about the existence of God, this is one of the best bits of the book. Some great relationship work going on here. Very dramatic, just really good stuff, and again, I can't really say too much, but good part of the novel, definitely something to look out for and enjoy. One thing that I'd like to add as well at this point, it's not worth a whole section, but since we're on the topic of characters, one of the things I've talked about a lot in my previous reviews with Anne Rice's books is she tends to have either kind of two modes of writing, or at least so far in the books that I've read, and they are heavy character-based novel, like the Interview with the Vampire, or plot-building, mythology-building novels, like Queen of the Damned is kind of the archetype of this, and Vampire Lestat are kind of in the middle. I guess the first half is more character-based, second half is more plot-based. The Tale of the Body Thief, to me, even more than the previous books, is pretty much perfect in terms of plot versus character. There is a central plot running through, and it's pretty well paced throughout, but it does take long digressions, well, not too long digressions, but does have digressions to have character development and things like that. Especially in the passages where Lestat first becomes human, at the beginning when he's conflicted, and at the end there's kind of an epilogue, which again deals with some fallout of the things going on. But none of this feels too overblown and too long-winded in a way that, say, Interview the Vampire might, or the Vampire Lestat in certain parts did. So it's nice to see Anne Rice is still getting better as a writer as she's going. She's able to balance a somewhat fast-paced plot. It's not action-packed by any means, it's still an Anne Rice book, but it's a nice balance between detailed character development and a nicely paced, well-thought-out plot. So I thought that was worth mentioning, because it's something I've mentioned a lot, and I do think this has probably got the balance the best. Although it doesn't have quite as much world building or mythology building as, say, the Queen of the Damned did, which, if you like that kind of stuff, you might prefer the Queen of the Damned to this book. Part 4, Conclusion. The Tale of the Body Thief, for me, is a fantastic entry in the Vampire Chronicles series, which, to be honest, I wasn't expecting, because I've looked at reviews, and people seem to be like, the first 3 books are really good, and then, meh. And I'm really not finding that. I thought this book was just really good, and over as an entire volume, I think I enjoyed it throughout more. I didn't get bored in any parts of the book in a way that's, with some of the other ones, there are passages where I just get a bit, the eyes glaze over. I didn't get that with this one. I enjoyed it, I enjoyed the plot, and I really enjoyed the characters and the relationships. So yeah, just a cracking entry to the series, and definitely worth a read. I'm looking forward to digging into the next entry of the series, and also soon, because I think the crossover novels with her witch novels start coming up, so I will also be doing reviews of her Mayfair Witches series, so be on the lookout for those in the future as well. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, and if you want notifications for more videos, don't forget to subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, and the Tale of the Body Thief in particular, and I also want to know what you think of my theory about it being somewhat of a shadow novel for Interview with the Vampire, because I think that's something that I really did see when I was reading it, so I'd like to share and talk more about that with you in the comments. But that's it for this video, so I will see you all soon. Stay safe and take care.